Nachbarraum sind, sondern jene, die am Livestream teilnehmen. Denn wir werden alle 3 Keynotes, die wir dieses Jahr anbieten, per Livestream im Internet anbieten. Herzlichen Dank, dass Sie dabei sind und ja, ich wünsche auch Ihnen viel Erfolg hier, eine interessante Teilnahme. And since our next guest is coming from the United States of America, I'm switching to English. The next talk will be about 2 worlds, about the IT departments and the business departments and companies. I think everybody of you knows these 2 worlds, and they're living together. And we have a person here today with experience in these both worlds and in 2 other worlds. She has a very impressive record of academic research, and she knows very well the enterprise world of IT. And she, as she's told me, she has been switching vice versa a few times. She will be talking about how to achieve business agility in an enterprise, and it's called Poised for Change, Achieving Business Agility. I'm very happy to welcome today Dr. Rebecca Parsons, the CTO of ThoughtWorks. Please welcome her.
Thank you.
Very good talk.
Thank you. Well, good morning, everybody. I won't try to pronounce good morning in German. Your English is far better than my German. I excuse myself by the fact that we're now in 16 countries and I can't learn all of those languages. So I do want to talk about this notion of business agility. And when we think about the history of Agile, it actually grew up in IT. But as we started developing our ideas around agility, and we started looking further afield, there is also the notion of lean manufacturing, which truly revolutionized how the automobile industry built cars, and part of why Japan was able to surpass the United States and other countries in becoming automobile manufacturers. And we started seeing that some of these underlying principles were much the same. And one of the things that we're seeing now is these underlying principles for Agile, things like extreme transparency, very rapid feedback, unambiguous definitions of done. These kinds of underlying principles are being applied in legal departments and in marketing departments and in design studios because there is nothing really specific to IT about these principles. And one of the things that we are starting to see is even publications in the United States like the Harvard Business Review are talking about this notion of business agility. So what really is business agility? And is what I call the virtuous cycle. And so you start with a testable hypothesis. And one of the big things that you'll find in Agile, in Lean, in many of these, is you want to come up with something that you can test. You have an idea, and rather than just saying, well, of course, I have a business case, and I'm going to develop this system, and I'm going to declare it a success, and I just won't bother to actually measure all of those things that were in the business case. Instead, I want to focus on a testable hypothesis. If I make this change, my conversion rate for sales will go up by this much. Or my average time in my call center per call will go down by this much. You want a testable hypothesis. And then you want to be able to deliver whatever system is required, whatever changes are required to implement this change. And you want to be able to do that quickly and effectively. And you need to measure. And this is a big change. For a long time, we didn't actually measure any of these business cases. You would have these multi-million-dollar business cases, and people wouldn't actually measure it. Did we lose something? Yes. Yep, I guess we did. Okay, well, I'll keep going, and that screen will blink at you. Oops, now we can't lose that one. And so we're actually going to measure this, which means we not only have to implement the system, but we also have to implement the measurement. And then we're going to start this all over again. Now, this doesn't sound that unusual, but what we're trying to focus on here is the fact that rather than saying that this cycle is going to be a 9-month cycle or a 5-year cycle, we want to get this cycle down as short as possible. And why do we want to do that? We want to be able to do more experiments. It used to be that the world changed slowly enough and customer expectations changed slowly enough that we didn't have to worry about how long systems took. And business models were stable enough so that if we got to the point where we were a market leader, we had a few years to be able to take advantage of that. None of that is true anymore. And we have to decrease the size of the experiments that we do simply because it is no longer necessarily clear what a successful experiment is going to look like or where that successful experiment is going to come from. And what we have been seeing is that in the past we would make these really big bets. Okay, I'm going to, for the next 5 years, try to work on this particular problem. We can't do that anymore. The world is too different 5 months from now, let alone 5 years from now. And in addition, what really constitutes good is changing more rapidly as well. And so as a result, we need to make many more experiments. And the only way we can realistically do this is if we can deliver it quickly and safely, know we can back out from it, and know that we're making multiple bets, because if I'm making 10 bets, probably one is going to hit. If I'm only making one, it may not hit. Okay, so what does this really take? What does it really take within an organization to be able to support this? And the first thing we need to be able to do is we need to be able, yes. That's what I thought. Okay. We need to be able to change both quickly and safely. And this is critical. I don't know how many of you have as much gray hair as I do, but I've been up a Saturday night, Sunday morning at 3 a.m. trying to be very careful, typing it in exactly as the run book said you were supposed to type in, and just hoping that nothing went horribly wrong. Because unfortunately, so often things did go horribly wrong. Regardless of how good the run book was, regardless of how careful you were, you got to the end of this and you didn't celebrate the functionality you put live, you celebrated the fact that the CEO didn't come yell at you for crashing everything in the middle of the night. So we need to be able to do this safely, because we are going to experiment. We are going to be experimenting on our users, but that's the whole point. Secondly, we need real visibility into progress and performance. And I'm not just talking about the performance of the system. I'm talking about the business measures. Go back to that testable hypothesis. That testable hypothesis was defined in terms of the business metrics that we are trying to move. And so we need to have enormous visibility into how well we're doing. Again, we're experimenting on our users. As a result, we need to be able to check very quickly if that experiment for some reason is going horribly wrong, so that we can back it out again, safely and quickly. And then we want to be able to experiment often, because we're not going to always get it right. And we're not always going to know where to look to see whether something is right. And so we want to be able to do lots of these different experiments. We want to be able to balance predictability and opportunity. And you could probably put an asterisk and say, and deal with competitive threats. Because the competitive landscape for organizations are very different than they used to be. and you don't really know what change is going to happen on some consumer-facing media site that all of a sudden puts tremendous pressure on you to deliver something as a retailer to your customer base, because right now your users, regardless of what business you're in, your users are also playing in the consumer space. And all of the expectations they have about usability and bring your own device and all of that, those expectations that they have in the consumer space, they are going to bring to you, whether they're your call center employees, whether they're your end customers, whether they're your partners. Those expectations are changing completely outside your ability to do anything about it. And so we need to be able to respond to those things quickly, but we need a mechanism, a process that will allow us to do this as safely and predictably as possible. And finally, this might sound like I'm saying you need to have a crystal ball, but in fact it's exactly the opposite. By trying lots of experiments, you can rely on evidence, you can rely on the feedback that you get from your user base to make more informed decisions, rather than trying to sit there in a room all by yourself or surrounded by your advisors or focus groups or whatever and try to figure out what people are going to need. You try lots of different things and you get feedback, not secondhand or third hand, you get immediate and first-hand feedback from the people that you are trying to serve with your system, and you find out whether or not this resonates with them, so that you can rely on evidence. And when you see something that works, even if it doesn't work in quite the way you expected, you can build on that, and you have evidence support that decision. Okay, so that's what we're going to try to do, and why we're going to try to do it. So how are we going to do this? And I'm going to talk about several different techniques. Each one of these techniques could at a minimum have a half-day workshop, if not an entire week workshop. So you're going to get a pretty high-level view of this. But these are some of the techniques that we're talking about. The first is a focus on pragmatic software quality. And I'm going to go into each one of these in more detail, but the focus here is on the word pragmatic. We want to talk a little bit about evolutionary architecture, how we're going to design and architect these systems to support this kind of change. Obviously, continuous delivery. A related notion of continuous design. And then finally, we need to talk about those pesky people and how we might organize ourselves within an IT shop to be able to actually make this happen. Because how we're currently organized, or at least how many organizations are currently organized, really don't support this very well. So, let's start with pragmatic software quality. As was pointed out, I've been an academic. I started programming when I was 13 years old, then I went to school to study programming, then I went out and worked as a developer, and then I went back to study computer science, and then I taught computer science, and then I decided I wanted to go back to the real world and deal with real systems. And so I have this very strange combination of having worked in the real world and also having a much more theoretical and academic appreciation for some of these concepts. And so the academic in me would love to say, no dirty code should ever exist. And everybody should be on a mission to get rid of all dirty code. I would love to be able to say that, but I can't. I've spent too much time in the real world. But we do have to take software quality into account, because bad code is harder to change. So how do we go about finding that balance? And one of the things that we've found works very well is to add another ility to all of those illities architects talk about, reliability and extensibility and all of that. I want to focus on one in particular, which is evolvability. It's not the same thing as adaptability. Adaptability kind of implies you're going to once again get out your handy crystal ball and see how people are going to want to change your system and build that in so that you can adapt it. That's not what I'm talking about. Evolvability is all about having the system be easy to change, regardless of how you have to change it. Because if you've made something adaptable, and all of a sudden you need to change it in this way, all of the work you put in to making it flexible and adaptable on this dimension is wasted. And it's probably a whole lot harder to do what you have to do. So what kind of software quality contributes to evolvability? And the single most important thing that we've found is readability and understandability. If you can understand a piece of code, it's much easier to change. And so there are many software complexity metrics that we've played with. Mostly they apply in the object-oriented paradigm, but they're starting to be extended into the functional paradigm. But what you want to focus on is how easy it is to understand a piece of code. Now, most of us are not lucky enough to be able to have a clean sheet of paper, a completely clean IDE where we get to always write new code from the beginning. We have to deal with whatever is left behind. And so when you're in that situation, how do you approach actually trying to get this system to the point where it is evolvable? And there are several different things I like to look at. The first, obviously, is the change log, your source control log. What things are actually changing? The second, go talk to the business users and find out what their near-term plans are and what aspects of the system that might touch, and add those to your candidate list. One of my personal favorites is to go and talk to the people in operations and the people who are responsible for customer support or maybe testing, and say, when do you get scared when somebody in the development organization says, we're going to change this? Where are those things that make you scared? And add those to the list. And look at where the bugs come from. And then compare all of those different lists against your run of what the software quality metrics say about your code. And the purist in me is going to shudder when I say this, but you might have a complete disaster of code over here that hasn't been touched in 4 years, that is actually working pretty well now finally, even if it is held together with duct tape and maybe a little baling wire. And hopefully by the time I have to change it, it will be so far out of date that I can just throw it away. The purist in me would like to say you still have to clean it up because it's terrible. And the pragmatist says, ignore it, it will go away. I want to focus my attention on the things that are changing, that I know are going to change, or that I know are contributing to current instability, for users getting confused, or for operations having a tough time supporting it when it's live. Look for those places and focus your attention on making those places understandable. Because if you're going to be in that code, you want to be able to understand it so you can start to understand the consequences of the changes that you'll make. So that's pragmatic software quality. We want to make sure that we're dealing with a code base that is as easy to change as possible. That doesn't mean it's going to be easy. That doesn't mean you're not going to be required to do some rework, but you at least want to make it as easy as possible. Next, let's think about architecture. In the past, IT has actually had a whole lot of control over those systems. I've been in organizations where somebody relatively low in the org chart, in the IT department, could stop a release going live, even if the CFO or somebody like that wanted it, because they had that much control over the systems. That's simply not true anymore. And one of the things that is happening is the business is saying more and more, I want these systems to work the way the business works. I'm tired of making my business have to run the way you want your systems to work. And given that, we need to focus more on what it is that the business actually looks like. How does the business think about its data? How does the business think about the processes? And then what do we have to do from an architectural perspective to support that? In addition, one of the things that we found is if you focus on the testability of a system, you will end up with a cleaner architecture. And it's not that surprising when you think of some of the architectural qualities that you want to look for. Things like good separation of concerns. You can spot those things if you have a lot of tests that say testing this and this and this and this and this. Well, maybe you've got too much. Maybe you don't have a unifying concept. There's certain things that you do from an architectural perspective, say by putting business rules in middleware, that are actually very difficult to test. That mechanism for testing those things is not as easy as it is to test code. And so if you think about how difficult or easy it is to test a system, and you drive towards testability in your design and your architecture, you will end up with an architecture that is easier to change. These are just some of the things, some of the techniques within evolutionary architecture. Obviously, refactoring databases and evolutionary databases is a critical part of this as well. If you think back to the history of how IT has slowly been gobbled up by people talking about Agile, it started with the developers, and then it went to the analysts and the testers, and they all said, okay, well, it's okay if the developers do it, but no, I need to do all of my analysis up front so I understand how things work together. And I can't test a system until it's complete, because then I'm going to have to do tests over again. And the DBAs for a long time probably had one of the best arguments about why they should be able to design their data model up front. And that's because data migration is hard. It shouldn't be. It doesn't seem like it should be. You're taking data in one format and you're copying it over to another format. How hard could that be? But everybody who's done it knows that it's not that simple. And so the DBAs could make a very good case. The longer a system has been in production, the less you want to change that database, because the harder that migration is going to be. And so the techniques around refactoring databases and being able to actually evolve a database by the same mechanisms that we use to refactor code is one of the critical underlying techniques for evolutionary architecture. So you don't have to magically figure out what your data model is going to be, and you can make some pretty radical changes in your database structure because you have this technique that will allow you to do that incrementally and understand where it is that migration is going horribly wrong, as opposed to just having, the tens or hundreds of thousands of error records the first few times you run your migration. So these various techniques focus our attention from an architectural and design perspective of what does it take for this system to be able to be continually changed. That's what we want to focus on. Continuous delivery. You guys have probably all heard a great deal about continuous delivery. I want to focus on a couple of aspects of it. And the first is that even though continuous delivery allows you to deliver as frequently as you want, I actually don't think for the purposes of this talk that that's the most important. Instead, the fact that you've automated all of this stuff means that the poor person who is up at 3 a.m. on a Sunday morning doesn't have to get it right, because the script doesn't care that it's 3 a.m. on Sunday morning. It's going to run the same way regardless. And you've de-risked the deployment process simply by all of the steps you had to put into place initially to allow this thing to run end to end. With the scripting of your environments, with the scripting of the deployments and the configurations, and the smoke tests that have been put in along the way, and the environmental tests, and all of those little probes to make sure that things have deployed properly. All of those things gives you that thing from the first slide, your ability to deliver safely. So it doesn't matter. And if you read the continuous delivery book, there is nothing in that book that says there's anything wrong with having a big green button sitting on the CEO's desk, and it's not going to deploy to production until a person looks at whatever they want to look at and hits the big green button. You can still do continuous delivery even if you have all of these manual checkpoints. The point isn't to get rid of the people. The point is to get rid of the things that go wrong. And that's all in the deployment. That's all in the configuration. That's all in the environment setup. That's all in all of the processes that you use to make sure your systems are properly configured and consistently configured so you don't have snowflakes and so you know exactly what environment that you're deploying into. There's nothing wrong with having somebody take one last look before it goes live. That's not the point of continuous delivery. The second thing, and this is something that doesn't get nearly as much attention, but I want to come back to it again, and that is this notion of thinking about a system is not actually live, a story is not actually signed off until we've got feedback from the production deployment that it's doing what it's supposed to. We're back to that testable hypothesis. We said that what we were trying to do was move the needle on something. Did it move? The story or the epic or whatever really can't be signed off as successful until you get that feedback from the marketplace. So this notion in continuous delivery that gets us thinking, it's not just about writing code. Features and behavior into the hands of the end user and having them use it and finding out whether or not it does what you really wanted it to do or not. So those are two aspects of continuous delivery that are of most importance here. The most critical one, obviously, is still that ability to deliver quickly, deliver safely, and roll back. And the disciplines that you have to establish within an IT organization to make continuous delivery happen results in those things. Now, what about continuous design? Much like the DBAs and the analysts and the architects, designers will often say, but I have to design a unified experience. I need to be able to say how all of these different pieces fit together, which means I need to know what all of these different pieces are. And that's how design shops used to work. And they would put these beautiful designs together and then throw them over the wall, and we know how well throwing anything over a wall works. They would throw it over the wall to the development organization, and they would have to change it all over the place because, of course, by the time they got it, things were different. And I've talked to many designers who said it drove them nuts because they would spend all of this time putting this design together, and they never saw it realized because it was always getting changed. And it wasn't changed the way they wanted it to be changed. And so, just like in other aspects of software development, we've had to think of how do we chunk up this design process? What is the work that has to be done up front? To set the design vision, to set the parameters, so that we understand what these different experiences are going to be like. How do we do continuous design? What does that even mean from the context of designing a user experience? How do we support the designers in saying, this is how I need to adapt things, while taking into account, okay, well, what kind of behavior change is this change in my system going to require of my users, and how easy or difficult is that to understand, and how well does it fit into the overall metaphor that I've come up with at the beginning that I'm using to test, I'm testing against at each one of these stages. So just like we want to deliver software continually, we need to think about this from the design perspective. As our expectations as consumers evolve, what does that mean in terms of how that system is going to respond to me and how I want to interact with that system? There's some really exciting developments. AR and VR are actually starting finally to get out of the military and out of gaming and into businesses like retail and real estate and some others starting to take seriously. We've got this new technology. This is going to radically change the way people think about how they would expect to interact with your systems. We have to be able to focus on what is it from almost a metaphor perspective. how am I going to look at these user journeys? How are my users going to interact with this system? And how does that change over time as I'm adding new functionality, as I'm doing these additional experiments to try to better address the needs of the users? Okay, so that's design. And that tells us a little bit about the overall process. We've talked about the front end. We've talked about operations a little bit. We've talked about architecture and design. We've talked a little bit about development. Now let's talk about those pesky people. Because the organization matters much more than people would like to admit. And what we're really facing here is a dilemma. If you think back to the crash around 2000, what happened? Businesses looked at their IT organizations and decided, you guys are a cost center. And what do you do with cost centers? You standardize everything. You stabilize everything. You resist every change that you possibly can, because that's the safest thing to do. And yes, from some perspective, you're building up technical debt and all of that, but you're weighing that against the fact that I've had to lock this thing down. I've had to standardize. I've had to cut my staff. So I have to prioritize stability. That takes a particular mindset of leadership of the people in the organization. That takes a particular approach to tools and decision making. You are going to use the tools that you have, not the best tool for the job. If you've got one that's adequate and you've got people who know how to use it, that's what you're going to use. Because that way you don't need new people, that way you don't need new licenses. And if you're looking at cost, these are the kind of decisions you're going to make. You're going to have processes that stand in the way of lots of changes because your goal is to stabilize. The problem is, all of a sudden the world changed. And now businesses are talking about responsive IT, and you're starting to see more and more businesses complaining about the fact that their IT departments are slowing them down. You have organizations who are going almost back to the days when PCs and such first came out, and you had shadow IT departments all over the place. People are now deploying things into the cloud because they can do things quickly up in the cloud, and they can do that on their own credit card and expense it and not have to talk to the IT department. Because what the businesses are starting to recognize is that they need their systems to be more responsive. They need to be able to take better advantage of technology. They want to see IT not as a cost center, but as a value generator. But the problem is, for the last decade and a half, they've been pushing and pushing on their IT departments to cut costs, to consider themselves just as a utility. There was a reason Nicholas Carr was able to say IT is irrelevant to organizations, because for a while they were like the power company. What they need now is an organization that is much more responsive. They need an organization that will take a few risks. If you think back to that cycle I talked about early on, some of those experiments are going to fail. Some of those ideas are not going to quite work out. But if you are really trying to be innovative, if you are really trying to explore new possibilities, and you never guess wrong, you're not taking enough risk. We want our organizations to be able to take risks, not stupid risks. We don't want to make a dreadful decision and then say, oh, but you told us it was okay to fail. It's not okay to be stupid. It is okay to try something that has a good chance of success, that's maybe based on some assumptions that you're trying to test out, and you test that out in the market and it doesn't work. That's what experiments are all about. If scientists use the same metric that we use to determine what happens if an experiment fails, science would have stopped advancing a long time ago. We have to become comfortable with this notion that some of these things are going to fail. That's part of why we need things like continuous delivery to make sure that the experiment, the fallout from a failed experiment is as contained as possible. But this requires a very different kind of organization. This requires people with a different mindset. This requires a completely different approach to resource allocation. If you're focused on costs, you're going to build functional silos. You're going to have your team of people who know Oracle, and you're going to have your team of people who know TIBCO, and you're going to have your team of people who know Java. And you're going to parcel out their time so that you can keep them as utilized as possible. In a value setting, you probably want those DBAs and those Unix experts and your language experts and your designers, everybody scattered and as close to the business, as close to the people who want to design these experiments as possible so they can get the experiments out quickly. But that probably means you have a whole lot more of them than you did before. It costs more money. But if you start thinking about this as a revenue-generating opportunity rather than a cost center, you don't care about that. You care more about things like time to market. You care more about the ability to quickly respond to market opportunities so you can get first mover advantage. You can't do that if you've got all of these centralized resources and someone who isn't in a position to even make the trade-offs of why is this marketing project more important than this customer support project. A resource manager sitting buried in the IT organization has absolutely no way to make that decision. You need to take that decision away and put the resources out in the departments where you can start to look at, okay, from a business planning perspective, where do I see my most potential in the marketplace? Maybe I'm going to give more resources to the marketing organization and make theirs a 3-pizza team instead of a 2-pizza team because they need, we need to support lots of experiments over there. Or maybe it really is in customer support because you're getting nailed in social media because of the lack of responsiveness of your support organization. Those are not decisions. Those priority calls can't be made from the perspective of cost. They need to be made from the perspective of what are my opportunities in the marketplace. Ever goes down, because I can't do that. If I'm going to try to support all of these different experiments, I am going to be taking some risks. And we just have to accept that. We need processes that try to make sure we're not being stupid, but allows us the flexibility to try some of these experiments, even if they might fail. We need people who are willing to take more risks. It is going to cost more. You are going to have more people, because they need to be further distributed. You can't micromanage their time in the way you could before. You want to be able to support a lot of collaboration between the designers and the developers and the people who are actually working with the end customers. And as those teams develop, they're going to get more and more context about the things that work in that market, or the things that work in your user base. And they're going to start co-creating with the people in the business organization. So this is our real goal. Our goal is this notion of business agility. We want to be able to respond quickly. We want to be able to support the experiments that people want to run. We want to be able to support lots of experiments. We want to be able to take advantage of new opportunities as they come about. We want to have this constant cycle of thinking, what are the next experiments that I can do? How can I measure what's going to happen? And how do we achieve that? I actually intentionally put this word adaptability, but it's modified here. This is not some artificial adaptability. This is not, I'm going to sit here and figure out somehow what are the different ways my system is going to change and be ready for that. I'm not going to try to do that. Instead, I'm going to focus on the ability to respond to the reality that is facing me in the world. And I need to think about that from an architecture perspective, from a tools perspective, from a process perspective, from a language perspective, from a people perspective. What do I have to do to allow my systems and my organizations to adapt to the reality that is out there, rather than the reality that I would like to impose upon the world? Maybe 40 years ago, IT departments could control their worlds a little better. That's not true now. And then I need to keep the systems ready. And again, think of systems very broadly. These are the people systems. These are the operational systems. These are my measurements. This is my regime for how I determine how things are going. This always has to be ready to change. That means I have to continually invest in improving those systems. I need to make those changes. I need to put those patches in when they come, not wait and let them all pile up. I need to be continually upgrading my systems, upgrading my thinking, checking my metrics, checking what my competitors are doing to try to see what I need to do to keep pushing forward. And these systems always have to be ready because we don't know when we're going to have to change them. So just assume you're going to have to change them all the time. We need to lower the risk of experimentation. And again, this is a technical issue, but this is also a people issue. We have to develop within our organizations a culture that can distinguish between somebody making a valid experiment that was based on what ultimately was determined to be a flawed assumption and that experiment failed, and someone who just made a stupid decision. And we have to organizationally understand that we need to deal with the person making the stupid decision, and we need to support the person who took the risk that didn't actually pan out. But hopefully he learned, okay, well, that whole idea was based on a flawed assumption. That's not an assumption anymore. Now I know what's out there. What does that new piece of information give me? We need our systems to make it easy to put things in, to try things, and to roll them back if they don't work. We need our systems to be able to support things like A/B testing so that I can have a sophisticated experiment that says, yes, okay, I've got my control group and I've got my new group, and look, the metric moved like I thought it would, so maybe this is a good idea after all. We need to have the systems in place to allow for the experimentation, to allow for the measurement. And sometimes it's hard to get a handle on these measurements. And there's the whole other talk about the dangers of metrics. But we need to have some way of measuring these things. When you look at the history of particularly enterprise IT, if you added up all of the successful implementations and the business cases and the people who wouldn't be necessary anymore, and the money that would be saved or the additional revenue that would be generated, the numbers would be enormous. But we never went back and measured any of those things. We have to get out of that, but that requires us understanding what those measures are and being able to safely measure it. Which means we need to maximize visibility and feedback. And to me, as a developer, one of the most frustrating things was to have my project manager come up to me in the bad old days and say, how close are you to being done? And we're all optimists. You know, I'm almost there. I remember trying to debug something once, and I started at 10 o'clock in the morning, and my desk actually faced a window. And I knew I was 5 minutes away. I was just one more test from being done. And I looked up at about 8:30 that night. It was pitch black outside. And I'd missed a dinner date because I was just so sure I was just one more change. We have to get out of that notion. We have to stop thinking that we can somehow say, I'm 87.5% done, and that's objectively different from the 82.5 that I told you last week. And to me, one of the most beautiful things about the discipline around things like agile software development, and it's baked into continuous delivery, is you have an unambiguous definition of done. And you're either done because everything passes, or you're not. And the only time any measure like 87.5% done has any meaning is if you count up the number of stories that actually pass, or count up the number of tests that actually passed. That's the only way. And so we're trying to get true visibility into what our development process looks like. But we're also trying to get true visibility into how our user community is responding to our system. What are the critical things that you need to know about the people who are using your system to understand whether you are delivering the right system to them? So we need not only feedback from the systems, but we need feedback from the users. And we need to constantly be thinking about, am I measuring the right thing? How am I measuring this? How do I know that I'm not encouraging behavior that I don't want by something I'm measuring? And that's usually where metrics go wrong. And finally, we need to align the organization. And when I think back about the history of IT, you started with the mainframes, and everybody ran on the mainframes, and you walked up to the window and you made your offering to the person behind the window and hoped that they would run your cards for you and hoped that they actually wouldn't drop your box of cards. And then it gradually got better when you didn't have to use cards anymore. And then we went through this period of decentralization. We had tools like Access and Excel, and we had personal computers, even though they weren't necessarily as portable as we would like them to be. And all of a sudden you had this massive decentralization, and you had more and more business critical functions being run on these systems that were squirreled away somewhere because they could get very rapid feedback. And you had people who would be working very close to the business people, because we still had IT people and business people then. But these IT people would work embedded in the business, and they would understand what it is, what kinds of tools, what kind of information, what kinds of reporting would help that business person make better decisions and do a better job and advance the organization. And then, of course, we realized how dangerous it was to have mission-critical systems running on a PC under somebody's desk when they, kind of got their leg tangled in the power cord and it came out the back of the PC and it's not backed up and all of those other problems. And we went back to this massive centralization again. And we went through all the cost cutting that I talked about earlier. And now the cloud has put us in this very interesting position. In some ways, it's massive centralization. Think about the percentage of data that exists in the world that is controlled by an organization like Amazon, because all of these different enterprises are now hosting their data there. So in some sense, it's a massive centralization, but in another sense, it's decentralizing. It's empowering. The barrier to entry to put things up in the cloud allows us to do lots of experimentation. The cost of starting a new business, an online business, has gone down, I think it's 3 or 4 orders of magnitude in the last about 5 years. Because you don't have to invest in a data center anymore. You don't have to invest in a hosting arrangement. You throw something up in the cloud, and if it sticks, then you expand your elasticity budget. So we're back to this combination of centralization and decentralization. But one of the things that we're seeing in this decentralization is also a return to this model where you have more and more IT people who are embedded in the business. But it's a little different because more and more organizations are becoming technology companies. Some of them have been quicker to recognize it than others. Financial services has kind of understood this for a long time, and you've seen in many of the investment houses that they have a very close relationship between the people who write the systems and the people who are investing, because they understand how valuable that close relationship is. But that's expanding out to retailers and manufacturers and insurance companies. And they're starting to realize that they have to fundamentally rethink what their business is. And when you do that, you have to fundamentally rethink how you are organized. And so we need to align the organization around this notion of business agility. We need to start thinking about how we are going to measure our IT people, not in terms of lines of code, not in terms of uptime of the systems, but in terms of the value that they are returning to the business, in terms of the way they are moving their business metrics. And by aligning development resources behind business metrics, you can start to change the perception of an IT organization from being a cost center that you don't want to invest in unless you absolutely positively have to, and a value generation engine where you actually do want to invest because you can get lots of return for it. And these are the changes that we are in a position now to make. We have the technological underpinnings, we have the infrastructure underpinnings, and more businesses are understanding that if they are going to play in this technology world, they cannot use the same kind of investment decision making and the same kind of cycles they did in the past. It simply won't work anymore. We are in a world where things are continuously changing. And we need our organizations and the way we interact with our customers to follow and continue to evolve at that same pace. Thank you very much.
So there is some time left for questions and answers. So first of all, thank you very much for your inspiring talk.
Thank you.
Very informative. And I think there might be some questions. No? It's surprising.
Everybody's asleep.
I don't think so. But actually, you were talking about change. Change is possible in the enterprise. You have described how it can be achieved, that the foundations are there. How is your experience, how many enterprises have made a successful change in the way you described it? Could you maybe name enterprises who were good examples?
Probably not globally known enterprises. There's an organization that we're dealing with in Australia that has completely realigned their organization in much the way that we talked about. And they are, they've adopted much of the Spotify model in terms of how they organize internally. They actually do some of their development work in China as well as some of it in Australia. So they've figured out how they want to parcel out ownership of their different systems. They've aligned their systems around the way they think about their business, as opposed to what they used to do was where they had very systems focused teams. One of the big sticking points in many cases, and this is why it's sometimes easier in kind of medium-sized organizations, if you've got the right leadership, it's always easy to change a very small organization. If nothing else, you just fire the two people that aren't paying attention, and you hire two more, and you're done. In a medium organization, very often you have enough influence from the top that even if you have, and it's often referred to as the frozen middle, that middle management layer that is not really understanding what their role is going to be in this new world, and people start to behave strangely when they feel like they're under threat. And if I don't know what my job is going to look like, I'm going to do what I can to keep my job exactly how it is. And that's what we refer to as that frozen middle of people who are disconnected enough from the top that what the CEO is trying to push down isn't necessarily going to filter through. and isolated enough from what's really happening on the ground that they can live in this bubble that somehow they can keep their job exactly how it is. And that's what you normally have to break. And the larger an enterprise is, the more entrenched that can be. And trying to figure out how to change an organization when you have too many of those players, that's where the challenge comes in. So I think what we're going to see, the middle-sized organizations can make those changes a bit more rapidly, usually because they've got a dominant enough leadership team that they can just force it through if they have to. But we are starting to see organizations, even really large organizations, say, I've got to figure out how to do this myself. Very often they will do that with some kind of small pilot and try to get people excited from the inside. Oh, that looks like they're enjoying their job. Maybe I had to go figure out what it is that they are doing. But it takes a very long time for changes like this to settle into larger organizations. And so I think we're still on a very long journey.
So maybe one of you has another question? No?
Or maybe they just want the break.
So maybe you ask yourself if you're in a, in what kind of an organization you are working. Are you in transition? Are you still in the old world? Or you have already arrived in the new enterprise world? Who would think that he is in such a new enterprise? No one. This is very promising for us as the conference organizers, because I think in the next years we have a lot to do. Okay, so if there are no questions anymore, I would like to thank again Dr. Rebecca Parsons. Thank you for being here and your talk. And now, next question.